the stream of thinking first year and second year as we work through this, the care we need. And I want to start out with a scenario, a simple scenario, but a common scenario, is a friend is struggling with anxiety. And what might be some things that your friend may want? They come for you for help, and what are they wanting in the midst of their anxieties? What could be? Say again? They may want you to fix it, good.
To know the future.
To know the future, because a lot of times uncertainty causes anxiety, right? Affirmation in terms of?
Just assurances, telling them that they're okay.
Okay, yep.
Everything's gonna be all right.
Yep, you okay? Fix it. Want answers for the future and empathy? Yep, absolutely. What can't you do? You can't fix it. What else? You can't change their circumstances. So write those two things down. Those are really important. You can't fix them, and you can't change their circumstances. You can't fix them, you can't change their circumstances. And so the C, 1C, is more or less a rhetorical question. So if they want affirmation, if they want for you to fix them, but you can't, if they want to know the future, which you're not a fortune teller, what care do you offer? So that's the dilemma, right? And that's why oftentimes in the church we can freeze. We go, oh, I don't know what to do. I can't fix their situation. I can't change their circumstances. I can't take away their fear and anxiety. What can I do? Right? And the reason why we can struggle with that is because we really want to love well. It's coming out of a good place. But one of the things that we've already talked about is that as we seek to answer the question, ultimate question, the care we need and the care we offer, we have to be reminded of the bigger reality. Because for the person struggling with fear and anxiety, that's all their reality is about. That's it. It can be so encompassing that it just can close in a person's world as a direct result of anxiety. But as we think about what care do we need, we should start first with creation. One thing that we didn't go over is in the previous page, but for the world, secular world, the unbelieving world, doesn't believe in this creation part of life, right? What's the explanation for how the world started? Basically, what are some of the theories? Big Bang. What else? Random chance. And what else? There's one major one. Evolution, right? So that explains who we are. And what's our purpose? I don't know. It's kind of a big explosion. Or we're descendants of apes. Whatever the case may be. But here's the fascinating but radically transforming idea. Could it be that before the fall, that God actually cared for us in the creation before the fall? We don't have information about that, right? Other than Genesis chapter 1 and 2, in which we see God. What do we see God doing to care for his people in Genesis 1 and 2? He created the universe, but specifically he created them. So if he created them, that must mean that he knows what they're all about, right? And then what do we say also with Psalm 139, verse 16? Right. He knew everything about us. But also he spoke to Adam and Eve. You know, he created us so we had to depend on his words. He created us to be in his presence. And so he cared for us with his loving presence and his words. And he also protected us. There was no evil, but he was there as our God. and he also outlined how we should live as well. And so in one sense, he cared for us before the fall. Too often when we think about care, we start with the fall. And so we dismiss. And here's the question that I want to put before you, and it's going to be up to you to wrestle through it, to decide whether or not this is what the gospel teaches. If God indeed created us, cared for us in creation before the fall, we've already got a sense of how the fall impacts us. Here's the question. Could it be that the care that we need after the fall, right now, is the same care that we received in creation? Let me say that maybe in a different way. The care, as you think about your friend who's struggling with anxiety, could it be that the care that the person actually needs, which is they need to experience God's presence, they need to experience God speaking to them, they need to know and experience God's love and His provisions and His protection? Could it be that that's the care they need in the midst of their fear and anxiety? Let me just pause and open it up real quick. What's going through your heart and mind right now?
Our need for him hasn't changed.
Right, right. So these are things to ponder, right? And, you know, I pondered this for a whole year, and so I'm not expecting you to fully wrap your brain around this right now, but it's interesting how God's story helps us to think through things, right? So let me ask another question. Was there anxiety and fear before the fall? No. Did Jesus come to create fear and anxiety in our hearts? No. Will we experience fear and anxiety in the new heavens and new earth? So, as you think about your friend's fear and anxiety and your own fear and anxiety, where in God's story can you attribute the fear and anxiety? The fall. Why is that good news? Your fear and anxiety is not good news. But why is it, if you believe that your fear and anxiety can be located and explained and reframed into the fall, why is that good news as you look at God's story? Is redeemable? There's a remedy for that. Zach, were you getting ready to say something?
No, I dropped my pen.
Okay. Kevin?
It's a future hope.
Is a future hope. Right. So, Shane, and then Kent. It's not original. Absolutely. And so what's the implication? That's right. It's temporary. I've never heard anybody say that before. That's really good. Did you jot that down?
I'm writing it right now.
Kent.
The song goes, one day riding the waves will be on the shore, and there'll be no more sickness, no more sorrow, no more war.
Right. That's right. But as a pastor and as a person, for me, as I hear people, but also as I hear my own heart, that's so far away, right? And so the question is, how does Jesus make a difference now? That's a question. We're not going to answer that right now. But the reason why it's good news that my fear and anxiety can be located in the fall, as you all said, the fall is not the end of God's story. Too often, when we're trafficking below the clouds, it feels like the entire story, right? We all feel that way. And the enemy does not want us to think, and the world does not want to think that there's any God or that God knows anything about what's going on in our hearts, in our lives. But it's good news because the fall is not the end of God's story. It keeps going. Here's another reason why it's good news. I'm coming back. I say it so often, I'm just going to write it down here. Psalm 139, verse 16, that God knew every day of our lives, and He formed every day of our lives before we were even born. that means he knows everything in your story, good, bad, and ugly. And he knows about your fear and anxiety in this moment. So, this makes sense that if God, who is a loving God, a God who created us to know and experience and image him, but he also a God who knows how the evil has impacted us, do you think that he would simply send Jesus from heaven into the fall just to bring us back in the right relationship and not do anything about how the evil impacts he won't do anything about how the evil impacts our hearts and souls in terms of fear and anxiety? Does that make sense? Let me say it again. Do you think a God who created us to know him and enjoy him and to glorify him with our whole lives, but yet he knows how the fall has impacted us and keeps us from doing that, and he recognizes that is a main issue for us, that when he sent Jesus from heaven into the fall, that he only came to reconcile us back in the right relationship? No, he came so that he not only could reconcile us, but that reconciliation brings us into union with the God of the universe. And because we're always, because of this union with Christ, it's going to be through Christ that he restores our souls. As we talked the other night, I think we talked the other night, that he's constantly restoring us because we're still living in the fall. And I think I pointed out in lesson 13 where you can read how Jesus restores our souls. And so let me stop there to see what questions you have.
I have a question on without sin at that time.
Yeah, I think I know where you're going. Let me just say, and then Pastor Scott can add more to it later.
Okay.
There's a difference between the old covenant and new covenant. The new covenant is established by the blood of Christ. And under the new covenant, we are in union with Christ, and the Spirit of God is placed within our hearts and souls. And so that makes it immeasurably different than with Adam and Eve. And so that changes the game. That's a game changer. And so that's a short answer, but Pastor Scott will continue to unpack that in the days and weeks to come as you continue to work through that. Okay. Kyle?
I could just add just a piece that answers it all.
But going to your question, yeah, Adam and Eve was without sin, but yet they still sinned anyway. God knows that to be true even after we become believers. But that's why the new covenant says nothing can separate you from my love. Even though I know that you're going to continue to sin against me. This just goes to show you the height and the depth and the width and the breadth, the depth and the width of God's love. It's like, nobody else loves like that. I don't deserve that, Lord, but thank you. And so, as we come to know the fullness of the love of Christ, it does something within us. It humbles us and makes us more dependent upon him. Where, just like we've been hearing over and over again, in terms of what's God's invitation, what you've been hearing over and over again is, I need to spend more time with him. I need to draw near to him. I need to abide in Christ through his word, right? And so it's all really seamlessly connected. So let's, somebody read, we're point number 3. God speaks into our reality. Remember, this situation with fear and anxiety, somebody read 2 Corinthians 1, 3 through 4, as you see here. Somebody read that, and then somebody read the next 2 as well, on point number 3. Okay, let me just push pause. Do you believe that? That the Father of compassion, the God of all comfort, can he, will he comfort you in all of your troubles? Not some, but all. God is declaring this. This is God speaking about himself. This is who I am. And do you believe it? So that's a question. Before we read the next one, let me set this up. In John 14 through 16, it's referred to as the farewell discourse. Jesus is preparing his disciples for his departure. And what you read here is some of the assurances that Jesus is giving to his disciples, but also you'll see Jesus' insights of of his knowledge of what we experience here in this world, despite his finished work on the cross. So who would like to read the next one? John 14:27 and following. We can have peace in the midst of trouble. We can experience two realities at the same time. Right? But let's just pause since you talked about trouble. What impact or what do you consider that Jesus says, in this world you'll have trouble?
Sickness, you mean what is trouble?
No, not what is trouble, but the very fact that Jesus said before he left, before he died on the cross, before he ascended, he goes, basically, when I'm gone, you're going to experience trouble. So how do you receive that given your reality? That Jesus says, in this world, you're going to have trouble, Karen. How do you receive that personally? What do you do with that?
But I want to be with that situation.
And so Jan just described our natural reaction to the trouble, and then also in the aftermath of that, surprise, we can go, why? But then the Spirit of God reminds us, but Jesus says, in this world I have trouble. And then there's a reframing, right? So good, thank you. So it's just really important that even though he says it in passing, we have to understand that, he's talking to me too, and he knows my troubles that I have now. Not just the troubles in the past, my present troubles, but also my future troubles.
Consummation.
But even on this side of heaven, is there anything that we can glean from or hope in the present, but I have overcome the world? How does that offer present hope and present help?
It's not a I will, it's already done it. It's conquered, right? It's finished.
Okay. So what does that mean for your fear and anxiety? For the reality that looms bigger than life oftentimes. When our reality looms bigger than life, how does it tend to impact how we see the bigness of God?
It's cloudy.
It's really, he's cloudy and he's small. But truth like this from John 16:33, it just reframes how we think again. Oh, that's right. Jesus has overcome the world. And so he knows about my troubles. He's overcome the world. I have present hope. Yes?
Well, it's clear, I think Jesus
Great point.
Liked that connection of those two.
Did everybody hear that? Okay. And so that's why when you read the Psalms, especially, it talks about God is steadfast. He's a fortress. He's a rock. You will not stumble or fall. But yet I do fall. But God will never stumble or fall. Just stick with him. Stick with me, he says. So we could keep going on because this is really beautiful. Let somebody read 1 John 4:16 and 18. And so God knows our fears, but God says, I have perfect love. And my perfect love is going to drive out your fears. Even though the fearful situation is still there, I imagine that everybody in this room has experienced something supernatural in that you experience God's peace in the midst of craziness. Even if it lasts for a moment, it's not long lasting, but it can happen in a reoccurring way enough to convince you that God is with you and he cares for you. And so when you see that perfect love cast out fear, an intellectual knowledge of the love of God is not enough. Because that's when you go, I know he loves me, but look what's going on right now. And that fear and anxiety is going to stay entangled in your heart and soul. So what care do we need? Number 4. Somebody just say something. What care do we need based on what we just talked about? for the fear and anxiety. We'll keep it very tight.
Presence of God.
We need God. We need His presence. We need His love. We need His words. We need His protection, right? And so here's the thing. Say again? And He tells us that, doesn't He? It's going to be okay. I got it. I've overcome the world and all of its troubles. Just stick with me. You know, as a church, universal, not just Four Oaks, but one of the things that I've come to understand in increasing ways is that within the church culture, we can allow doubt to linger. Because doubt is common, isn't it? It's because we're living in a fallen world, and the pressures and the pain keeps us, it causes faith struggles, right? But if you look at the armor of God, what does the shield of faith do? Say louder so everybody can hear. From what? The fiery darts, the fiery arrows of the enemy. So if we start doubting and we allow the doubts to persist, what's going to happen? The shield drops and what happens? Right? Literally. Evil is always powerful. It's more powerful than us, and it will always overpower us. But that's why it says, put on the armor of God. You know, buckle the belt of truth, the breastplate of righteousness, the shield of faith, the helmet of salvation, you know, with your feet footed. What does that say? I can't use that. You know what I'm saying, the readiness of whatever piece. And then the sword, which is with the word of God. But I've come to understand the reason Paul writes that it's either 1 Timothy 6:12 or 2 Timothy 6:12. I don't know which one. But he says it's a fight of faith to believe. And as soon as the doubts drops the shield, we're going to take a beating. And every one of us knows that to be true, doesn't it? Okay. So what care do we offer? Okay, so somebody read 2 Corinthians 1:3-4 in its entirety. So above, it was only a portion of it, and point number 5 is all of it. Somebody read, please. Thank you. So what care do we offer based on 2 Corinthians 1:3-4? Right. 2 Corinthians 1:3-4 is a gospel pattern. We first receive from God, and then we give to others. We receive from God, we give to others. Our lives have patterns, so does God's story have patterns. Another pattern that we talked about is what was meant for evil, He uses it for good. Those are gospel patterns there. You can count on it because they're promises as well. And so a definition of gospel care is encouraging one another to abide in the love of Christ, to restore our souls so that we can love God and others. The so that is really important because God just does not restore your soul because He's a nice God, which He is, right? But He created us to live in a certain way. He created us to love. And Jesus sums it up by loving Him and loving others. So caring for one another with the gospel means that we come alongside of one another and encourage them to abide in Christ. And that's why we have intentionally given you opportunities to abide personally with Christ, but also doing it as a community. Because that's what being the church is all about. Okay? And that's what being a disciple is all about. So let me just pause because